I've titled this talk, Food for Thought. And we're going to talk about a few general things, and then we might look at some of the issues which might affect our minds. And we are living in very troubled times, and I think we need to have absolutely clear thinking patterns. There should be nothing that interferes with our minds so that we are not able to discern between right and wrong. And there are a few problems in this world that we can do absolutely nothing about. You can't jump off the planet if it starts bothering you. And we need to know what some of the risk factors are. If the air is polluted, I can't say, well, today the air is polluted, I'm going to stop breathing today until it gets better. Then I'm in serious trouble. So there are some things I cannot prevent. And, well, what do I do about these things? Can I do something to try and prevent some of these issues? If we look at the 10 leading afflictions that cause death in the United States, then there are 3 very important ones, namely heart and blood vascular disease. That is the most prominent one, followed by cancer, and then by other. Those are the 3 biggest killers. And then come all the others like chronic lung disease, accidents, pneumonia, influenza, diabetes, AIDS, suicide, etc. So the 3 biggest killers: heart vascular disease, cancer, and other. I'd like to know what other is, seeing as it's the 3rd biggest killer on the list. Underlying factors that scientific fraternity has found to be very significant are poor diet and inadequate exercise, the #1 cause of disease. Secondly, tobacco. Then comes alcohol, and then infectious diseases, etc., firearms, illicit drugs, etc. So again, #1, lifestyle diseases. #2, a lifestyle disease. #3, a lifestyle disease. It's pretty obvious what the problem is and where it lies. So what are the factors that lead to longevity? #1, don't smoke. It's very simple. You cut out that huge factor in your life. Get enough sleep, 7 to 8 hours. That's your regeneration time. We have a anabolism and we have a catabolism. There's a time to build and there's a time to break down. There's a time to fill up and a time to detox. And these are all coupled to your sleeping rhythms. And if we have proper sleeping rhythms and we have regularity in those sleeping rhythms, then it'll lead a long way to improving your health and your cognitive function. Everybody knows that sleep deprivation causes havoc with the brain. It's worse than alcohol when it comes to some of those issues. Eat breakfast regularly. Now, if you eat breakfast regularly, the very name tells you that you are breaking a fast, because you're not eating when you are sleeping, which is a very sensible thing, because you're not going to assimilate, you're going to desimilate when you are asleep. So you want to eat breakfast regularly, because early in the morning your metabolism is at its highest, and if you do nothing other than change your eating patterns to breakfast and a later meal, dinner, lunch, whatever you call it in this country, then already you are improving your metabolic processes. And if you eat exactly the same, you can lose weight just by shifting the time that you are eating, because you are metabolizing it better. And a good metabolism means food for thought, that the energy is available for your brain. So that's a very good shift to make. No eating between meals. There's a lot of controversy on that issue. Many people believe you must have a lot of small meals in the day. No, if you have a whole food diet, you just need 2 meals in a day, and you don't want to exhaust your digestive juices by popping something into your mouth every 5 minutes, because every time you go into that process, the glands all secrete their secretory products and you deplete them. So you want to have them nice and ready and stored when you have your next meal. Maintain proper weight. Exercise is very important. And I would say no use of alcohol. How many patients are killed by their cures? This was a very interesting article that appeared a couple of years ago in which they talk about the adverse reactions to drugs, maybe one of the leading causes of death in Western countries. One of the leading causes. Now, drugs have a way of ensuring that some people don't make it to the age to which they could aspire. And if you just look at some of the celebrities in the world, how many of them are dying from adverse drug reactions, even medical prescribed medication, not necessarily recreational drugs. And it is probable that this is the number 3 killer in the world. So if we can live in a drug-free environment, I'm talking about prescription drugs, well, that would go a long way of giving us longevity. And then, of course, prescription drugs have many, many side effects, and many of those side effects affect the mind. They make you tired. Many of them have warnings on them. Do not drink and drive. Your cognitive function will be impaired. Do not do this and that. And we want to have clear minds, so we want to make sure that we are not on unnecessary medication. Now, what happens to all those toxins that we can do nothing about, that come with just with the very fact that we are alive? Well, we have to mop them up. We have to get rid of the free radicals, those unpaired electron substances in our body. And this was interesting when they discovered that vitamin pill fails to fend off cancer. You see, when they discovered that vitamins had essential roles in mopping up free radicals and that they have important functions in your hormone and enzyme systems, then it became very popular to isolate everything and give it in a tablet form, because that's easier than changing your lifestyle. And when they discovered that yellow foods are cancer preventive, well, let's isolate the beta-carotene and that should solve the problem. Now, this was years ago when they discovered that beta-carotene yellow foods are good for you, and they used 2 studies. The one started before the other. One was called the Pokud study and the other one was the Finnish study, where they wanted to prove beyond a shadow of doubt that beta-carotene prevents cancer. Now, what better group to use than smokers, right? Smoking is carcinogenic. Let's give one group beta-carotene and the other one we give a placebo, and then we'll know, and then we can put on our label, beta-carotene inhibits cancer. And these studies were supposed to go for 10 years, but they stopped the first one after 4 years because it became quite evident that the extracted beta-carotene was producing more cancer than the placebo. Totally contrary to what you would expect. The Finnish study had been going for quite a while, and it had been running for over 7 years when they analyzed that and came across this terrible problem, which was identical, and that's why they stopped the Pokud study. So what was the problem? Dangerous beta-carotene, said the press and the medical magazines. As soon as you isolate a substance from its environment, it can very often have the exact opposite effect of what it has in its natural combination with all the other foods and flavonoids in the food that we have at our disposal. So if they analyze all the foods, you find that, you know, they have high sources of vitamin E, which is a powerful antioxidant, and very important for brain function, very important. And it's wheat germ oil and the sunflower seeds and the nuts and the olive oils, and these that are rich in those, and there are antioxidants in the fruits and the vegetables, strawberries, plums, oranges, grapes, all these fruits and vegetables, garlic, kale, spinach, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, all of these are highly active as antioxidants. So basically, what is the best tablet that we can consume? The real thing. Those are the best tablets that anyone can consume. Now these days, people are becoming aware of this fact that just isolating something might be counterproductive or counterproductive. So what they do these days, they do have some companies where they concentrate a whole fruit down to one tablet. And then basically everything that was in the fruit should basically be in the tablet. And these whole food vitamin supplements are probably quite good and quite expensive, but if you eat enough variety of fruit, then you can spare yourself quite an expensive urine. So here we have some of these high antioxidant foods, and the berries are excellent antioxidant foods. And I mean, in Canada, in this country where I'm standing now, you have such a wonderful berry country. You should be consuming these all year round and freeze them or whatever, make smoothies of them. Wonderful stuff. And they've analyzed what they are, and it seems as if every single fruit or vegetable has something else to offer, like Brussels sprouts has the phytochemical sinigrin added to others, or the broccolis have the sulfophanes, or etc. There are a whole host of them. Caffeic acid, not to be confused with caffeine, in fruits. Phytic acid in grains. Now, phytic acid gets a bad press sometimes because it is an enzyme inhibitor. And people think, well, if it inhibits enzyme action, then it must inhibit digestion, and therefore it must be bad for you. So in some quarters you hear that certain grains are bad because they have these inhibitors. You know, when you think about things in terms of creation, you get a totally different mindset. You begin to understand things from a different perspective. And you ask yourself the question, would the God of the universe make a mistake like this to put something in the grain that prevents the complete digestion thereof? This must be a horrendous mistake. Perhaps if we were God, we could improve on this. And you don't think like that in the scientific fraternity, because the divine foot is never allowed in the door. But they found out that many foods have strange starches, for example, which we cannot digest. And the grains have these inhibitors. But the interesting thing is, you know, we are not just looking after ourselves. We carry with us organisms that are symbiotants and which provide numerous functions in our body, and our colon has to be kept in a perfect state in order to deal with many, many issues, and those bacteria want to be healthy. Now, what if I digested everything that was useful and hogged it all for my own self, and by the time it got through to the colon, there was nothing sensible left for those organisms to utilize? Well, then I would be in trouble, right? And so they found that the bacteria can actually cope with the phytic acid perfectly, and they're actually getting the residues for their own activities. And these strange carbohydrates that you find in foods like potatoes, etc., besides the normal starches which we get, We don't digest them, but they do. And so we have a healthy flora because of this, and it leads to a better, intestinal integrity. So I don't think there are any mistakes. Now, what are the best brain foods in the world? Dates. This is nature's highest source of glucose aside from honey. And all fruits, generally, are the best brain foods in the world. Why? Because the brain is a glucose hogger. It mops up your glucose, as we will see in a moment. And then all these fruits, of course, figs, bananas, grapes, carob, currants, and all dried fruit are especially good. And it's fascinating if you look at history, the armies of old, the armies of Israel, the Roman armies, they marched on fruit. And if they didn't have fresh fruit, they marched on dried fruit. That was the ration. And there's nothing better than that. And then, of course, the nuts, particularly the almond, legumes, all legumes, because they're rich in carbohydrates, whole grains, avocado is an excellent brain food, and the brain consists largely of fat. So a good fat that is digestible, doesn't increase cholesterol, and doesn't make you fat, would be coconut and coconut water. Excellent brain foods. Now we'll come to those in a minute. So the legumes provide perfect brain food. The nuts, excellent. If you look at the sprouted seeds, they give you the antioxidants. These are all excellent brain foods. These will give you natural antibiotics, the garlics, and the cruciferous vegetables will give you a host of chemicals that will mop up free radicals and are highly anti-carcinogenic. So these are excellent brain foods as well, because they create the environment in which the brain can function. Umbelliferous vegetables, Zolanaceae, that's the tomato and the eggplant and the peppers and the potato. Those are foods that are either very high in antioxidants or high in antioxidants and starches. And the onions and the pumpkin family. So carbohydrate is the food that the brain needs. If you want to have a healthy brain, you must have carbohydrates. Your brain occupies only 2% of your body weight, but consumes about 20% of your body's oxygen and up to 50% of your body's glucose. That's incredible. And it functions only on glucose as an energy food. Now, what would happen, therefore, if your diet consists largely of protein, as people do in the world today? You'd have to convert that protein first to glucose before the brain can utilize it. With all those toxins that are produced in the process, which we discussed last time, where all those amino groups are split off and the ring structures and all the toxicity that comes into the body, the free radical formation, all of those issues. Whereas if you took the foods that we just spoke about, then the antioxidants would be there and the carbohydrates would be immediately available. Now we have to deal with this carefully because the world is very anti-carbohydrate diets in the world today. And the reason is because they totally ignore the fact that there's a vast difference between refined foods and unrefined foods. A vast difference. Nowhere in the world do we find natural, refined foods other than products that are used by animals such as bees, for example, will produce honey, which is a partly refined food. But even that has all the minerals and enzymes that you find in nature, in nectar, still present in them. Now, a number of years ago, the study was done on various rats that they fed various diets. And the interesting thing about this group of rats over here, it's an old picture, but it makes an interesting point. These rats here on the left, you can see their nice taut little tails, they're being held by their tails. They are alive and well and have healthy coats. And these rats on the right over here are on the point of death. They're still alive, but they're on the point of death. That's why they're not moving. You can see their tails are limp. They're not pulling at all anymore. And if you look at them, although the picture is poor, you can see they're pretty tatty. They're moth-eaten. They've seen better days. And what is the difference between the two groups? Because they are of identical age. Absolutely identical. The only difference between the two is not even in diet. They got exactly the same food every single day. But the ones on the left got as much as they needed, and the ones on the right got as much as they wanted. It's the only difference. So the ones on the right overate, and they lived only about half as long as the others. So overeating, even on good food, is just as bad as binging on bad food. So a good piece of advice to have a healthy brain is not to take all the energy and use it to digest your food because you've overstuffed yourself, but to eat enough so that the digestion is well, rapid, proceeds according to plan, and the energy is quickly available. Refined foods are devitalized foods. They impede the immune system. They eventually will enhance diabetic problems. They are carcinogenic because they don't have the fibers, and so the system becomes clogged. And rats fed carcinogens and complex carbohydrates show lower incidence of breast cancer than rats fed carcinogens and simple sugars. Scientists are sometimes quite mean. To feed an animal specifically a carcinogen is not a very nice thing to do, but if they give them complex carbohydrates, well, then it doesn't happen. Even skin cancer. Even skin cancer. You know, we put all these creams and all these things on us. They found that if you have a diet rich in phytochemicals, then your probability of getting skin cancer is very, very low. Even when they irradiate the animals, if they give them a phytochemical-rich diet, they don't get those cancers. So what about these foods? Rich, refined, sweet foods. Well, it's glucose. There's lots of sugar there. Is that the way to go to feed your brain? That is the question. And if not, why not? Because the brain utilizes sugar. Eating simple sugars, says the Cleveland Clinic of Wellness, or highly processed carbs provides a quick spike and drop in blood sugar response, which leads to low levels of the brain chemical serotonin. And low serotonin levels lead to feeling bad, crabby, and irritable. Serotonin is involved in the regulation of mood, sleep, and appetite. Low levels of serotonin are linked with depression and anxiety. In fact, the psychiatric drugs that are used in the world to treat people that have schizophrenia or violent emotions are actually drugs that elevate serotonin levels. So obviously, there must be a problem with highly processed, refined foods, and we want to know why. If you look at a normal grain, you'll see it has various components. There's a germ, which is rich in fats and enzymes and some proteins. And then you have the endosperm, which is rich in carbohydrates. And then you have the bran on the outside, which is rich in fiber. And there are two kinds of fiber, soluble fiber and insoluble fiber. Now, if you have the whole grain and it passes through the intestine, then the insoluble fiber creates the bulk so that the fecal matter can pass through unobstructed and pass out readily. And the soluble fiber is equally important because the soluble fiber actually binds to sugar. Now that's an important point. If you have the soluble fiber in your diet and you have the sugars in your diet, they are held by the soluble fiber, but not with strong bonds. So as you're digesting your food, they come loose periodically and they enter your bloodstream. If you take the soluble fiber away and you take the sugar in its refined form, then there is no soluble fiber to hold on to the sugar, and therefore it shoots straight into your bloodstream and gives you this glucose spike. You have to deal with this glucose spike because your brain operates in very even glucose levels. That's why we have these systems, these hormone push and pull mechanisms to maintain glucose at absolute equal levels in as far as is possible. So a spike is highly dangerous. It damages the blood vessels. You have to get rid of it quickly, otherwise the brain can go into coma. So you release vast amounts of insulin and it drops to below par and you're hypoglycemic. And now the brain is craving what it's not getting in the right quantity. The only way to ensure that you get it in the right quantity is to eat it as a whole grain. Then you have slow release of glucose over a period of time. And you can even get by with one meal a day if you have the slow release, because it's constantly going into your bloodstream as it passes from the top to the bottom. So this is your safeguard. Now, why don't we have that anymore? You know, in the old days, things were easy. They used to mill the grain with stone mills. And the grain goes in and it grinds this lot together and the whole package deal comes out on the other side. Marvelous. Now, if you're milling this portion over here, which contains the fats, and you leave that grain stored in its milled form, then it can go rancid. If you want to feed millions of people in cities, and you have to produce millions and millions of tons of this to feed humanity, then grinding with a stone is a slow process. We need something fast. And this is where the bolting machines were developed that don't grind everything but work on rollers. So you feed it in and it goes through rollers which are spaced at different levels, and it cracks this outer layer off in the first rollers, get narrow and narrow, and then eventually this is crushed fine and comes out. And this, being full of oil, the germ, actually, because it's oily, sticks to the rollers. So then you have a scraper on the roller and it scrapes it off. So at the end of the process, you have three products. You have the wheat germ, you have the white flour, and then you have all the bran in three piles. Well, that's marvelous, because now you can sell three products rather than just one product, which is good for the industry. So the one goes into the cosmetic industry, the other one goes into the constipation industry, and the other one goes into the white breads and the sweet things that we eat on a daily basis. And because it is dysfunctional, we are basically, all of humanity, in this crisis of being, well, hypoglycemic. This is colon cancer rate and the amount of fiber. And you can see that as the fiber increases, so the rate of cancer actually comes down. Now, what's also fascinating about fiber is that the non-soluble fiber, which sees to the motility in your gut, actually combines with excess cholesterol and toxins. That's very fascinating. I mean, why should the grain be able to bind with the substance that you want to get rid of when it is in excess? It smacks of design to me. And that would prevent, you know, all the extensions and the diverticuli and all those gut problems that we have in the world today. Now, this is typically what happens if you have a glucose meal without fiber. As you look at the glucose levels in the blood, and these are minutes after a meal, so this is 180 minutes, so that's 3-hour period. When you have that meal, immediately the glucose level rises, and then in response to insulin release, which then also rises, it actually drops down, and here it is at a lower level than when you started. So we call this portion, this drop, hypoglycemia, low blood sugar. This is insulin secretion in the two graphs, and you see this graph over here in the glucose ends up where it was, basically. So what happened here? This is when you add fiber, then the glucose level doesn't drop down to hypoglycemia. So it's fascinating that if you go into nature and you take a fruit, the more sugar there is in the fruit, the more what will there be in it? The more soluble fiber. Now, who thought of that? Who thought of that? The sweetest thing on earth that you can chew as a fruit is a date. And a date is sticky and tacky. Why? Because it's rich in soluble fiber. So if you want to give your kids a treat, then get them used to taking a date. Because then the glucose doesn't shoot into the blood, but rises, gives the energy, and over a period drops down and slowly releases it. If you want to go on a marathon run, what would you take along? What would be a good food to take along? A date. Or maybe a banana, but a date in particular. These are the symptoms of hypoglycemia: heavy sweating, shaking, these are the autonomic activation symptoms, warmness, heart palpitations, anxiety, shivering, or the neuroglycopenic symptoms, which are confusion, drowsiness, weakness, difficulty in speaking, loss of concentration, visual disturbances, double vision, dizziness, all of these combined. Now, this is about a description of humanity today. This is what they all are. Humanity today is largely in this state. Here's a German medical magazine. Short, rapid rise in glucose is particularly dangerous. And then it describes the damage it does to the blood vessels and the damage it does to your glucose metabolism, your insulin, hormone control systems, all of these. The American Nutrition Association writes an interesting thing about excitotoxins. Now here's something else that we have to talk about. The taste that kills, which explains that certain amino acids, when overly abundant in the brain, can cause neurons to die. Many biochemicals can act as neurotransmitters in the brain. Some excite our neurons, others calm them. In particular, glutamate, aspartame, or aspartate in this case, cysteine, are three amino acids that excite our neurons and can be called excitotoxins. They are now added in large amounts to our food supply. All right. So if we look at the whole food industry, if you eat a lot of fruit, you're getting the sugar almost instantly, slowly, because of the fiber that is in the natural fruit. Your brain gets fed all the time. Now your brain also has to send messages between neurons via the axons and the dendrites, and this is a very controlled reaction. Some of these messengers, there are many messenger types in the brain, some of them are actually single amino acids. Now, this is fascinating. Between your brain and the rest of your body, there's a blood barrier. So that only that goes through to your brain that must be utilized. You don't want your neurons firing when they shouldn't be firing. You want them to fire when they are responding to certain reactions. So these neurotransmitters are stored in very specific places and enzymatically released when necessary, in no other way. And they are simple amino acids. Now, they discovered that if you take a simple amino acid, some of them, if you put them in your mouth, even though they are amino acids, they stimulate your taste buds, and particularly your sweet taste buds. So they taste incredibly sweet. And this was very useful because now you could add this to a sweetener and not get all those carbohydrates in their free form, which, because you're producing too much insulin, pushes them into the cells, and eventually you get obese as a consequence. So now they started adding these to the diet, because what harm can it do? After all, it's an amino acid, and we all need amino acids. So there's a huge industry in the world dealing with free amino acids. But the problem is that some of them are actually neuron inducing activity. They produce neuron activity. So glutamate, aspartate, cysteine are three of them. And there are others as well. Now, in what form do we get our amino acids in our meals? Protein. Protein. We don't get free amino acids in nature, we get protein. Now, when we eat the protein, no digestion takes place in the mouth. Eventually, in the stomach, you add enzymes, and they're split into polypeptides, large protein chunks. Then they go through to the duodenum, trypsin is added, and they are further broken down. So here in the first part, there is no absorption of amino acids because you're dealing with large molecules. A little bit further down, smaller portions, no absorption. Then as you go further down the intestine, they're split into smaller sections. And then when you get to the bottom of the intestine, then you get the exopeptidases, which split off the individual amino acids. Now that's very important. So where in the digestive process do the free amino acids actually start coming into existence? Right down in the bottom of the intestine. Nowhere in the top portion where you are absorbing. Right down in the bottom. Now, the top portion is drained by blood vessels which go directly into your blood. That's why glucose from fruit kicks in quickly, because it goes directly into the blood. It's beautifully, is it a word I may use? Designed? So that those foods go quickly into your blood. But these at the bottom, the free amino acids, they don't go directly into the blood, because the bottom is drained by the hepatoportal system, which means that blood goes to the liver. And the liver is a factory. And the liver takes the free amino acids and packages them 2 by 2 into dipeptides. Now they're inactive in terms of neurotransmission in your bloodstream. They're floating around. They can be taken up into the brain. They'll do nothing in your brain. Nothing. They won't transmit any activity over there. And then they're packaged and placed and stored in particular areas. And when necessary, an enzyme splits them, and the free amino acid can do its job. So in a natural meal, in a normal environment, you never get free amino acids. But now you've discovered that they are sweet. They're not really sweet. They just stimulate the sweet receptor. And it fools the brain, because the brain now also knows, oh, this is sweet. And it sends a message, there's sugar coming. And then you start producing insulin to cope with the sugar. And eventually, there is no sugar, because you're on a diet and you're on this stuff. And so eventually, the body says to the brain, excuse me, you are lying to me, and thou shalt not lie. So you don't produce enough insulin anymore, and then you're in trouble. You're a type 2 diabetic, basically. So what about these substances? Here's a partial list of the most common names for disguised monosodium glutamate, because that produces the free amino acid which actually stimulates the brain. Remember also that the powerful excitotoxin aspartate in NutriSweet and L-cysteine are frequently added to foods, and according to the FDA rules, require no labeling at all. Additives that always contain MSG, I didn't give the whole list, otherwise we'd get confused. But of course, if it says monosodium glutamate, it has those excitotoxins in it. Hydrolyzed vegetable protein is another name for disguising that name. Hydrolyzed protein, hydrolyzed plant protein extract, sodium caseinate, calcium caseinate, yeast extract, texture protein, autolyzed yeast, hydrolyzed oat flour. These all are actually acronyms for MSG. So you have to start reading. When you buy, use your eyes. Read the labels. Now I want to talk about one, just to give you an example of what happens when you take this, because this is the one that is used most commonly. And we're talking about foods that affect your brain. Aspartame is the technical name for the brand names NutraSweet, Equal, Spoonful, Equal Measure, all of these. And it accounts for about 75% of adverse reactions to food additives, as reported by the US Food and Drug Administration, and there's the webpage. There are some 90 symptoms listed in the report of the Department of Health and Human Services. Headaches, migraine, dizziness, seizure, nausea, numbness, muscle spasm, weight gain, rashes, depression, fatigue, irritability, tachycardia, rapid beating of the heart, insomnia, vision problems, hearing loss, heart palpitations, breathing difficulties, anxiety attacks, slurred speech, loss of taste, tinnitus, vertigo, memory loss, joint pain. And the list is extensive. And the question is, what does it do to the brain? Remember, it's free amino acids. Now let's see what else. The following chronic illnesses can be triggered or worsened by ingesting aspartame: brain tumors, multiple sclerosis, epilepsy, chronic fatigue syndrome, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, mental retardation, lymphoma, birth defects, fibromyalgia, diabetes. I mean, this doesn't sound like a very pleasant product. It's made of 3 chemicals: aspartic acid, phenylalanine, and methanol. Now, aspartic acid is an amino acid taken in its free form, unbound to protein. It significantly raises blood plasma levels of aspartate and glutamate. Aspartate and glutamate are excitotoxins. So in other words, when you're taking this substance, your brain is firing when it should not be firing. So you will have reactions. And many food additives, colorants and all of these do exactly the same thing. I don't want to go into every single one, it's not necessary. But these excitotoxins actually stimulate the brain to such an extent that you have the hyperactivity in the world that we have today. I remember in the good old days that when the teacher said, sit still, everybody understood what it meant. Nobody understands in this day and age what it means. And my wife, for example, taught in a school with problem children in a very, very, very poor society. And all they ate was refined food. And if you can think of all the troubles that came along with that. Now, what happens when you do this? Excessive levels of phenylalanine in the brain can cause the levels of serotonin in the brain to decrease. Now that again will have all kinds of results. And you can have bipolarism, you can have episodic events in the brain of deep depression to euphoria and all of those issues. And then the methanol that is produced when you take this is actually not just a byproduct, as you will see. The recommended limit of consumption is 7.8 milligrams per day. Recommended limit of consumption. It should really be 0. A 1 liter aspartame sweetened beverage contains about 56 milligrams of methanol. Heavy users of aspartame containing products consume as much as 250 milligrams of methanol daily, or 32 times the limit. I don't think you really want to do that. Aspartame can be found in instant breakfast foods, breath mints, cereals, sugar-free chewing gum, cocoa mixes, coffee beverages, frozen desserts, gelatin desserts, food, juice beverages, laxatives, multivitamins, milk, drinks, pharmaceuticals, supplements, medication is full of it, shake mixes, soft drinks, tabletop sweeteners, tea beverages, instant teas and coffees, toppings, wine coolers, yogurts, you name it, it's in everything. If you start reading the label, you will see where this product has been introduced. Now, what is fascinating to me, that this is a modern industry. It's for this generation. And some of the dates when we come to when these things were developed for the first time become even more fascinating. Now, the world today is using stimulants, and when you get up in the morning, you need to have a stimulant. So the stimulants used are tea or coffee or cola drinks, or if you're addicted to smoking, nicotine, or if you're a druggie, cocaine and amphetamines. And then at the end of the day, because you're highly stimulated, you need a depressant. So you come home, you need an alcohol, you need a beer or a glass of wine or a whiskey or whatever. Or if you're into this sort of lifestyle, narcotics and cannabis or marijuana or hashish. Some people use hallucinogens like LSD, ecstasy, etc., inhalants, petrol, glue, thinners. That's if you're really down and out and can't afford the other stuff. The fact of the matter is, I'm not going to talk about all of these. I'm just going to talk about the stimulants and what they do. Now, on the left over here, you have a healthy city lung. And you can see it's full of dark spots because, well, you have to breathe the air and it's full of pollutants. It shouldn't really look like that, but that's considered a pretty healthy lung. On the right over here, you have the lung of someone who smokes. Now, the chemicals that are produced when you smoke are absolutely horrendous. The benzene derivatives that are carcinogenic, the nicotine, of course, and then, of course, the massive oxygen deprivation that you have in your system directly affects your brain. It benumbs your brain. Besides that, there's a massive difference in the development of children that grow up with parents that smoke. Now, these studies were done by a colleague of mine on rats. And he took pregnant rats, pregnant female rats, and he injected by weight the equivalent of what a human being on average smokes, if he is a smoker, of nicotine. So they got a daily dose of what a human being by size, so a very small amount of nicotine injected into the mother while she was pregnant. And then he looked at the pups after they were born as to how the lung developed. Now the pups, of course, never smoked. Smoking is even worse, because then you're getting all the smoke and all the other tars and all of these issues into your system. This is just the nicotine that was injected into the mother, and supposedly there's a barrier, a blood barrier between the placenta and the mother. Obviously, that didn't have any effect. This is the alveoli volume. This is the size of the air sacs in the lungs. In the control group, where the mother did not receive nicotine, the alveoli were small, and actually, after 42 days of growth, they declined in size. If their mother received nicotine, when these pups were born, then the alveolar size actually increased. And you can see the difference is highly, highly, highly significant. Now, what does that actually mean? They only received 1 milligram per kilogram body mass of nicotine per day, simulating a mother that smokes. Now, the alveoli number, that's the little air sacs. Here again, the control group, you can see that the alveoli number after birth and during development increased. And if they simulated smoking mothers, then it also increased, but not nearly as much as the other one. And again, the difference is statistically highly significant. Now, what does that mean? Okay, here's an electron micrograph of the lung surface. This is a control, and these little air sacs that you see there are the alveoli, and that little star in there gives you an indication of the size. So this is a healthy lung, and the alveoli, as you can see, all look very healthy, and they're compact, and they're all about this size. They're all small. These are the actual air passages going through the lung, and these are the alveoli. Fine. Let's have a look at one where the mother received nicotine. Again, you can see over there, there's the little star, and look at the size of the alveoli. They're much larger, and they're also torn. Here you can see tears in the alveoli. So in other words, they're very large in this one compared to the other one. Now that's very significant. The larger they are, the smaller the surface area relative to volume. That's simple mathematics. Volume increases by the cube, and surface area increases by the square. So the larger something gets, the smaller the surface area gets relative to the volume. So there was not much area there to absorb the oxygen, and the number of alveoli was less, far less. So the oxygen exchange was much poorer. Now, if you took those lungs of those little pups and you put them in an acid solution and you dissolved all the cellular material so that only the elastic connective tissue would remain, then this is what it looked like in a control where the mother did not smoke. And you can see it's a beautiful elastic network. So the lung is very elastic. If the mother did smoke, in inverted commas, it looked like that. Same magnification. Totally destroyed lungs. Nothing left. So depriving your body on a permanent basis of oxygen, what will that do to your brain function? And if you have received such a lung and inherited from your parents a lung with poor elasticity, then you have special work to do. You have to make sure you have good blood. And we spoke about red blood corpuscles in the previous lecture. To make sure that you have maximum oxygen absorption, you must make sure that your blood is at the right fluidity. Take the antioxidants to make sure that the oxygen that is available gets to the right place. Exercise to strengthen your lungs. And these are the conditions we are living in. Now I come to a favorite topic. What about tea and cocoa products? I mean, or coffee. Tea, coffee, and cocoa. I mean, chocolate is such a delightful thing. And I find it fascinating that it has, the cocoa bean has a very interesting history. It goes right back to the Aztec times, when they believed that the god of wisdom of the South American nations was the one who gave this drink because it was used in the religious rituals. Much like people today in some religious systems use narcotics to enhance their spiritual experience. And you will find this in many, many cultures and many, many religious forms. And what is also fascinating is that I believe that many of the food forms which affect your brain only came about after the 1840s. Chocolate has only been around in its present form since the 1840s. Fascinating. Is there something being fed to humanity to influence the mind in these days in which we are living? And if we look at it prophetically, it becomes even more interesting, because the clash between truth and error has never been greater than it is now. And I believe that we should have a lifestyle that will give us maximum brain power and maximum discernment. So let's have a look at some of these foods and ask ourselves the question why these are the mega industries in the world today. If we look at the biggest industries in the world, and you can look it up on the web, you just punch in, it's very simple to find, the largest companies in the world and the largest food and drug companies in the world, and then you should find something interesting. Well, here's a picture, Mars Incorporated. It's one of those companies that falls into that top company in the world category. Some of these companies are number 1 or number 2 or number 3 up to number 10 in the hit parade. I mean, this is competing with mega mining companies and computer companies, etc. Mars Incorporated makes these sweet little treats like Milky Way, Snickers, and Twix. And here you have the cocoa beans being imported for the production thereof. And these things have only been available since after the 1840s. Never before in history, except perhaps as this watery drink that they made for ritual purposes. And then it became popular when the cocoa bean was brought to Europe by Christopher Columbus. And it wasn't popular at all because it's bitter and horrible, and you have to get used to the taste. And so it became popular in the courts of kings. Isn't it interesting how corruption starts from the top down and not from the bottom up necessarily? Here is Nestle, one of the mega companies in the world. We know that they are famous for their chocolates and all of these. These are the biggest companies in the world. Or the Pepsi company, which of course produces Pepsi and Mountain Dew and all of these drinks and PepsiCo and all these fast foods and these snack foods, which largely have all of the substances in them that affect the brain. TBHQ. I mean, that's a petrochemical that is highly toxic to the body, and they add it to food. It's unbelievable. And you'll find it in virtually all snack foods, unless you become exceedingly health conscious and actually start reading the label. All the unnatural antioxidants, they're all loaded to these products. And we'll see why this is important in a little while. This is the Unilever group. They make mayonnaises and they make ice cream, which is also a milk, sugar, and often chocolate combination. I think this is the second biggest company in the world today. Used to be the biggest. And that's Coca-Cola. And the name is interesting. It already tells you something and rings a bell because it's derived from the cocaine plant. And if we look it up, a little bit of history, does Coca-Cola contain cocaine? There's nothing quite like the sugary rush that accompanies a cold glass of Coca-Cola, up to 12 teaspoons of sugar per can. 12 teaspoons of sugar per can, 0 fiber. What will that do to you? That'll give you a glucose surge par excellence. It'll shoot your glucose up, give you the concomitant insulin surge, bring you into hypoglycemia, make you depressed, reduce your brain function until you become non-functional. And the way to solve that problem is to take another one. And the same with coffee or any one of those drinks. And then to make it worse, they add caffeine. And we'll see to that what that does in a moment. Until 1903, the world-famous soft drink contained a significant dose of cocaine. While the Coca-Cola company officially denies the presence of cocaine in any of its products, past or present, historical evidence suggests that the original Coca-Cola, in fact, did contain cocaine. But Coke wouldn't become completely cocaine-free until 1929. That's an interesting date, very interesting date. When scientists perfected the process of removing all psychoactive elements from cocoa leaf extract. While the modern-day recipe for Coca-Cola is highly prized company secret, there is reason to believe that the beverage still contains the same non-narcotic cocoa leaf extract that it did in 1929, and according to the New York Times, the Coca-Cola company was continuing to import coca leaves from Peru and Bolivia until at least the late 1980s. So what they're doing, we don't know, but probably the drug is extracted now so that it's no longer there, but it has been replaced with caffeine. Another mega company is Mondelez International. They produce Cadbury and Trident and Oreto and all of these products. So what are the mega companies in the world today? Those that produce chocolate, those that produce milk-sugar combinations, and I didn't even list here the coffee companies, and well, I didn't even list the alcohol companies. So these are what are the mega companies today? Alcohol, chocolate, and these sweet things, and coffee. Now here's a tea plantation, and you can see it's nicely maintained, perfectly square, and looks magnificent. And this is the eland, the largest antelope in the world, and it is chewing away at this acacia tree. Now when the eland actually chews this plant, the plant, when it is broken, releases a pheromone, and the pheromone instructs the rest of the plant that it's being eaten. And immediately the plant responds by introducing more tannin and certain alkaloids. And immediately, when those levels of those toxins rise, the eland decides that this plant is no longer palatable and moves on. Now, what's interesting is this substance that is being produced is a pheromone, and so it also has an effect on the trees in the immediate vicinity. So this prevents overgrazing. I think it's a perfect design structure. So the animal will eat here, because a herd normally passes through, they will eat, and then they will walk away, and they'll walk 100 meters, 200 meters, and go and graze over there where the effect is not felt. So the animal is clever enough to avoid the alkaloids which are produced so that it won't be overgrazed. Because what's the point if the animal destroys the entire plant? This is a very clever mechanism. Now, is this evolution or is this design? To me, it smacks of design. It's a beautiful design. Can you see how nice and flat the surface of this tea plantation is? Absolutely perfect on top. Now, plants don't grow like that, so how did they get like that? Well, you can't go and prune those. It would take too long with a little shear or something like that. So traditionally, you walk through it with long sticks and you just knock off the tops. And they're so au fait with it, they do it beautifully, and you get this nice flat surface at a height where you can easily harvest. Perfect. But when you slash it like that and you break the leaf, then what does that simulate? Somebody chewing the plant. And so how does the plant respond to this? Increases the toxins, the alkaloids and the tannins, to prevent further grazing. Now it's interesting that the plant also takes care of its regrowth. Again, is this evolution or is this design? So it takes care of the regrowth. How? By ensuring that the new plant that grows, the new leaf and the bud, contains the highest level of these toxins, so that the animal will avoid it and not come and chew all the new growth, so that the plant has an opportunity to regenerate itself after it's been eaten. And that's how it is avoided. And this is exactly what mankind does. It simulates the grazing, chopping it off like that, and then they go and they pick the regrowth. Can you see the lighter ones? That's the regrowth. And it consists of the two leaves and the little bud. And that has the highest level of caffeine and other alkaloids in it. Now, if you use it just like that, you call it green tea. It still has high levels of caffeine. It also has, like any plant has, nutrients in it, of course. But if you have a toxin together with nutrients, then rather take something that is not affected like that. Now, if you take natural herbal teas, like, for example, rooibos tea or any herb tea out there, when they harvest it, it's the whole plant they harvest. It's not done in this method, so there is no reaction by the plant. You're getting just the good stuff. But using this method, you're actually picking the most toxic portion that every sensible animal on the planet would avoid. Now, man is not satisfied with the green state unless you can fool a health freak to take it. So what he does is he dries it. What does that do? It concentrates it. And then he goes a step further. Then he takes this dried state and he puts it in big vats and starts fermenting it. So bacteria come and they ferment it. What are the bacteria using? Everything that's edible in the plant. And when the fermentation process has stopped, that means that everything that is a nutrient has been removed. So what is left? Pure, unadulterated toxin. That's what's left. Now you take this and you dry it again, concentrate it down, package it, and you call it black tea. And black tea is full of compacted toxins that every sensible animal on the planet, except the stupidest planetary animal, will avoid. Now you pour that into a cup of hot water and extract the toxin. What does it taste like? Disgusting. It's bitter. That's why these drinks didn't take off, except for ritual purposes, until they turned it into a culture, and in order to get it down, what did they add? Sugar. But that wasn't enough, so they added milk, because milk masks the bitterness and it flows better down into the stomach. And the sugar, of course, masks the taste. Now imagine what trouble you have to go to make something that is impalatable, palatable. And why do people do it? Why? Why is it a mega industry? Here are the structures of the alkaloids that you find in tea, coffee, and cocoa. They're very similar. Theophylline is what you find in tea, and it's very similar, just a small change over there. Theobromine is the main component of cocoa, which is used in chocolate, and caffeine is the main component that you will find in coffee. But you'll find caffeine and the other products in tea as well. So they're there in various combinations. Now, caffeine influences many body functions: gastrointestinal function, weight loss, kidney and urinary tract. It affects that, cardiovascular system, aging, nervous system, women's health, diabetes. And if you want to go into a little bit detail, it produces high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and it also increases homocysteine. And homocysteine increase is to do with heart function. Acid reflux, GERD, or gastroesophageal reflux disease, women's health, PMS, menopause symptoms are affected, infertility, osteoporosis, irritable bowel syndrome. I mean, the list is endless. There are also, of course, fatigue, insomnia, and mood disorders, depression, migraine, glaucoma, prostate inflammation, etc., etc. So caffeine is a dangerous product. But I'm concerned about the mental health issues. Now, one of the things that caffeine does, before I get to those, is that caffeine, when you absorb it, affects your adrenal gland. And immediately when there's caffeine present, the adrenal gland produces cortisol. And cortisol is your fight and flight mechanism. So you will produce adrenaline and cortisol, those two. The adrenaline gives you that lift and that hype, and the cortisone makes you release your stored glucose in your muscular system and in your liver. So you get this massive glucose surge, and your glucose goes up, but there's no fiber. And normally that's your fight and flight mechanism, so you're going to utilize the glucose to run away from your enemy or to fight your enemy. But if you're sitting behind a computer and you're having a cup of coffee, none of that happens. So what's going to happen to that glucose? Insulin, down it comes, and you're what? Hypoglycemic. So just the caffeine will do what the sugar meal will do. Exactly the same thing. So now, what if you take a can of Coca-Cola that has 12 teaspoons of sugar and you add caffeine? What happens? You get a double whammy, because both of them will produce hypoglycemia, and it will put your mind into such a roller coaster that it's unbelievable. But theobromine in chocolate, caffeine in coffee and in tea is not the only substance that we find that have these effects. So these alkaloids are actually classed as stimulants or psychoactive drugs, which act primarily on the central nervous system, where they alter brain function, resulting in temporary changes in perception, mood, consciousness, cognition, and behavior. Caffeine is the world's most widely consumed psychoactive drug. Stimulants appear to have positive, invigorating effects on the mind and body, but in reality they exhaust the system, which causes cravings for more stimulants, and this way a dependency on the drug is developed. These alkaloids induce symptoms which mimic many psychiatric disorders. Now, imagine how useful it would be for a company if it could add an addictive substance to its food. Then everybody will buy it, especially when they become addicted, even if they don't know it. Well, that's how you become the number 1 or the number 2 or the number 3 or the number 4 company in the entire world. That's one way to get rich. But what if there's a spin-off and a byproduct? That you become incapable of discernment. Is that a possibility? Nutritional biochemist Stephen whatever says in his book Caffeine Blues, if a person were injected with 500 milligrams of caffeine, that's less than the dosage in some 16-ounce brews, if it went directly into the bloodstream and not via the gut, within about an hour, he or she would exhibit symptoms of severe mental illness. Among them, hallucinations, paranoia, panic, mania, and depression. But the same amount of caffeine administered over the course of a day only produces the milder forms of insanity, for which we take tranquilizers and antidepressants. In over a decade of practice as a clinical nutritionist, I have seen firsthand with thousands of clients that caffeine is a health hazard. Anxiety, muscle aches, PMS, headaches. However, if that's all caffeine has done to you, you're lucky. What about people misdiagnosed as neurotic or even psychotic who spend years and small fortune on psychotherapy, all because no one asked them about their caffeine intake? Can we afford in this day and age, with so much deception, to be psychotic and neurotic? The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders states the following: manic episodes, panic disorders, generalized anxiety disorders, amphetamine intoxication, sedative, hypnotic, and anxiolytic withdrawal or tobacco withdrawal, sleep disorders, medication-induced side effects, e.g. akathisia, that's if you can't sit still. When you have to move. You have to move. You cannot sit still. Can cause a clinical picture that is similar to that of caffeine intoxication. All of those things, caffeine will do exactly the same thing. Here's another publication from the medical journals. Caffeine intake often perpetuates many of the factors contributing to weight gain and continued obesity. Coffee and caffeine intake aggravates stress, including physical, mental, and emotional stress, leading to increased levels of glucocorticoids, which I spoke about just now, including cortisol. A well-documented relationship exists between chronically elevated levels of these stress hormones and the deposition of excess fat in the abdomen, leading to obesity as well as increased caloric intake, particularly increased ingestion of fats and sugars. Just run your mind over this. The last century is the century when refined food came into the world, when the mills were all changed to bolting mills, when the hypoglycemia epidemic started, when refined foods took the place of whole foods, when the antioxidants were reduced, when cigarette smoking was introduced. I mean, where did cigarettes come from? The only ones who smoked funny things were the Indians. And Columbus took it back and said, now look what these guys do, you know, they do this kind of thing. And humanity said, but they're crazy. And it took years and years and years and years and decades before people started doing these things. In this last century, all of these things have come to a head. Gamma-aminobutyric acid is a neurotransmitter naturally produced in the brain and nervous system as well as the heart. It plays an important role in mood and stress management and influences a person's sense of well-being. So this is a natural hormone that gives you your sense of calmness and well-being. Caffeine has been found to interfere with the binding of gamma-aminobutyric acid receptors, preventing it from performing its calming function. Who would want you to be in a constant agitated state? Is there an enemy somewhere on the planet that might have that propensity? Now, theobromine gets even worse. And it doesn't have the same effect as caffeine on your glucose metabolism, but it has an even wider scope in its activity. Now, if you take a simple slab of chocolate, a 1 ounce Cadbury milk chocolate, it contains 44 milligrams of theobromine. Chocolate syrup contains 89 milligrams in 2 tablespoons. And chocolate flavor mix in whole milk, 2 to 3 heaped teaspoons, 8 ounces of whole milk, 120 milligrams. Now, don't the kids drink that a lot? Don't they drink that a lot? And then they all have the combination of milk and sugar, which is a deadly combination. Because milk, when it enters into your stomach, is not digested as other foods are. In fact, it goes quickly through to the rest and is absorbed basically undigested because we don't have the enzymes to deal with the casein anymore after we are weaned. And it changes the acidity in your stomach. And then the glucose ferments in there, and you have fermenting products, which is the worst kind that you could possibly have. Because what you really want is to get good glucose, but now you're getting fermented fatty acids. So that's not really brain food. Okay. Chocolate, food or drug. This is a publication. Although addictive behavior is generally associated with drug and alcohol abuse or compulsive sexual activity, and this is another very interesting pointer. Originally, the South Americans in their rituals, and you know that the religions were largely sexual religions, sexuality played a very important part. They used the cocoa extract as an aphrodisiac. So it stimulates the lower passions. And it's very fascinating that if a young man takes a young lady out, it very quickly comes to mind to appease her with a slab of chocolate. And it's interesting that women in particularly will become addicted because of hormone cycles to chocolate. And those cycles actually run with the hormone cycle. And this is a very dangerous thing in the society that we live in now, because I don't think there's anybody that waits for something which is called in the old days matrimony. Chocolate may evoke similar psychopharmacological and behavioral reactions in susceptible persons. A review of the literature on chocolate cravings indicates that the hedonic appeal of chocolate, the fat and the sugar, the texture and the aroma, is actually important. What does it actually do? Is likely to be a predominant factor in such cravings. Chocolate may be used by some as a form of self-medication for dietary deficiencies, e.g. magnesium, and by the way, it causes magnesium loss, and it causes calcium loss. And magnesium is a very important enzyme for brain function, very important. or to balance low levels of neurotransmitters involved in the regulation of mood, food intake, and compulsive behavior. So it has an effect directly on serotonin and dopamine. Chocolate cravings are often episodic and fluctuate with hormonal changes just before and during the menses, which suggests a hormonal link and confirms the assumed gender-specific nature of chocolate cravings. Chocolate contains several biological active constituents, methylxanthines, biogenic enzymes, cannabinoid-like. This is fascinating. This is like cannabis, marijuana, like fatty acids, all of which potentially cause abnormal behaviors and psychological sensations that parallel those of other addictive substances. And here is an exhaustive list, and it's very small, so I'm going to go a little bit closer to see what it says. Theoretical effects of chocolate on the brain. And here are some of the substances. The biogenic amines are tyramine and nonephrine and synephrine, and a whole list of them, tryptamine, all of these. These potentially induce drug-like neurophysiological effects. So all of these substances, you will find them in the cocoa plant. And then you have the methylxanthines, which is the theobromine and the caffeine and all of those. These are the stimulants that we've spoken about, which are most commonly known about. But there's another substance which we'll talk about a little bit more later, sulfonylurenol. This is a dopaminic active compound, and it's a psychoactive compound in chocolate. We'll talk about it just now. Then you have neurochemical imbalance. Chocolate contains high concentrations of carbohydrates and fat, which together may increase brain serotonin synthesis and enhance mood. So the combination milk and sugar affects your serotonin levels. Just that by itself. I'm fascinated that more than 120 years ago, an author wrote that milk and sugar combination is not to be consumed in large amounts. Not entirely discarded necessarily, but not in large amounts. And then you have endogenous opioid peptides, possibly produced when chocolate is consumed because its high concentration of fat and sugar, and the brain's interpretation of the experience is then pleasurable. So this creates the euphoric side, the happiness syndrome. And then you have other compounds, fatty acids, that may target endogenous cannabinoid systems of the brain. So they induce symptoms like cannabis. And then you have the neuropeptides, which fluctuate in specific brain peptides and cause differences in the way neurotransmission takes place. Far too much sugar is ordinarily used in food. This was written more than 120 years ago. Cakes, sweet puddings, pastries, jellies, jams are active causes of indigestion. Especially harmful are the custards and puddings in which milk, eggs, and sugar are the chief ingredients. The free use of milk and sugar taken together should be avoided. I frequently sit down to the tables of the brethren and sisters and see that they use a great amount of milk and sugar. These clog the system. Now that's an interesting statement. And I always wondered, is it true? And I had this interesting experience. I've told it before, but perhaps I can tell it again. I was writing a book on health, and I was searching all the scientific literature, putting it together with the research we were doing in our own laboratories. But one of the issues that I didn't have time for at that stage, and I wanted to find something in the literature, was the question milk and sugar. And I couldn't find anything in the literature. And as I was mulling over this, I thought to myself, well, maybe a higher force can help me to find this? And as I was sitting in my office, I received a phone call from my colleague, and he says to me, could you bring your students over? I forgot to tell my students to stay behind for a lecture by a guest speaker. And this was very unusual for somebody to say that, and I was not very inclined to do it because, you know, I have my own work to get through with the students, but I did it. And as I sat quite grumpy in that lecture, the man said that he worked at a health institute, a medical fraternity, and that he was instructed to, you know, find out what the health benefits of chocolate were by a chocolate company. And so he decided, well, the easiest way to do this is to divide the chocolate up into its components and see what the effect is, and then what the effect is if you combine them. So to one group of children or students, he gave the equivalent of the sugar in a chocolate. In other words, a glass of sugar water. And he tested their fat levels and their cholesterol levels and their blood pressures and all the parameters that are sort of necessary. The next group received the equivalent of milk. The next group received the equivalent of the milk and the sugar. And the next group received the equivalent of the milk and the sugar and the cocoa. That should tell you what happens, right? And he said he tested the sugar, and lo and behold, up went the glucose levels in the blood. Strangely, the fat level also went up, the triglycerides. And cholesterol was affected, and he was wondering why this was, and probably as a protective factor, it lines the blood vessels so that you don't get a glucose spike. And then, the milk. Well, up went the fat, you would expect that, but it all came down within 3 hours. Then the combination of milk and sugar. Up went the fat level, up went the sugar level, but it doubled. It went much higher than you would ever expect individually, and then it didn't come down. It stayed there for 10 hours before it came down. Now, if you want to put a surge of triglycerides into your blood vessels, then that's not a very good idea. Firstly, it's very much harder for your blood to pump. The oxygen decreases. And this is the reason why milk and sugar combinations are so popular before you go to sleep. Because they cut down the oxygen supply because your blood becomes so sluggish, you just go to sleep. So that's what they do. And if you add the cocoa, well, then you get a triple whammy, because now you're getting even the spike which is induced by the glycogen release from the liver. So the very worst combination possible was the last one. The second worst was the milk and sugar, and the best one was to take them totally separate and never the two do meet. So I found that very interesting. So far too much sugar, she said, is being used. It clogs the system. It literally clogs the blood vessels. I frequently sit down at tables where brethren and sisters see great amounts of milk and sugar. These clog the system, irritate the digestive organs, and affect the brain. So those neurotransmitters are being produced. Now, what is this other substance that we found? Salsolinol and chocolate addiction. Cocoa and chocolate contain this tetrahydrosequinolone alkaloid salsolinol, up to a concentration of 25 micrograms per gram. And it is a dopaminergic active compound which binds to certain receptors at a certain level. It inhibits the formation of cyclic AMP. That's your powerhouse that keeps you running. That's your energy machine. And the release of beta endorphin and ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone, which affects your adrenal gland, in a pituitary cell system. Taking the detected concentration and the pharmacological properties into account, this product seems to be one of the main psychoactive compounds present in cocoa and chocolate, and might be included in chocolate addiction. Do we really want to take substances that have been invented for the last generation to keep them non-functional, and incapable of making informed decisions? Do we really want to? Or do we want to avoid it? A neurotransmitter called anandamide was isolated in chocolate by the scientist in 1996, and it is an endogenous cannabinoid neurotransmitter found naturally in the brain. And it targets the same brain receptor as THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, which is from the drug cannabis, the active ingredient in cannabis. How does this work? Brain cells have a receptor for THC, which is the active ingredient in marijuana. The receptor is a structure on the surface of a cell that can lock onto certain molecules, making it possible to carry a signal through the cell wall. This is the lock and key system, and the active compound will lock itself to the protein on the membrane of the cell, and that triggers a reaction inside the cell, and in this case, the THC, that chemical reaction, is what would make someone feel high. So it's actually a drug. It's a drug. Now, what about all the smart drinks that we have in the world today? These are high caffeine drinks, and they contain substances which are addictive. And there are now cases being investigated where young children who are addicted to any one of those, or some of them, are actually dying as a consequence. We are in a generation that has to have a healthy mind and a healthy body. And any drug that we take affects our discernment. And you know, sometimes we think I have to take it to stay awake, or I have to take it for this, that, and the other. There are other ways of dealing with it. To go and make a cup of coffee, and eventually to go and sit and drink it, takes a little bit of time. Take a power nap. They found that if you take a power nap, some people sleep with their keys in their hand, and when they fall asleep, the key falls out of their hand and they wake up. That's enough to give you a power nap. And it's interesting that the great movers and shakers of this world actually did that. Winston Churchill was well known for his power nap, and if you interfered with his power nap, you were in trouble. There was a world war. 1 Corinthians 10:31, whether therefore ye eat or drink, or whatsoever ye do, do all to the glory of God. And I'm fascinated to see that in the literature that we have at our disposal, it states quite clearly what the effects of coffee and tea are, and that it's in a worse category than any of the other things that are listed as harmful for us in these times in which we are living. And it is my conviction that we, in the times that we are living in, must make sure that our minds are pure and clean and functional. Thank you.